Hello, babies, and welcome back to D-Talk, your safe space to explore your creativity, expand your critical thinking skills, embrace your cringe, and prime yourself for connection. I'm your host, David, and I have probably one of the least pleasing flavors of tea sitting in front of me, if you can see the steam if you're watching on YouTube. And, but we're doing it for a reason. It's called Throat Rescue. It's got that licorice root and a bunch of other some such nonsense because my throat does in fact need rescuing. Somehow I'm talking more as a content creator than I ever was as a teacher. And speaking of being a teacher, today we are going to talk about inclusive language. Let's get into it. Okay, so I mentioned being a teacher, and if you followed along with my content journey, you'll know that I have experience mostly as an elementary school teacher, but I recently last year started a master's program of education with a specialization in neuroscience. No, I'm not a brain surgeon. That's the first thing that everybody thinks, but that's not the reality. At this point, I just have 2 neuroscience classes under my belt, and I have learned a lot from them, but I'm not about to give you brain surgery, so don't think that that's where this is going. And I want to talk about inclusive language, and this isn't going to be specific to the classroom, even though that's the lens of which I'm going to filter a lot of my personal experiences through. But last year, at the end of my summer semester, I was doing a presentation on the work that I had done in my course, and one of my professors asked, they said, "David, you speak in very inclusive language." I don't think they said inclusive language, but they said you speak in a way that includes everybody. The subtext was inclusive language. And they said, "Is there a spot for people to go? Like, is there a document? Is there a piece of content that people can consume in order to improve their skills speaking inclusively?" And I didn't really have an answer, but I was really interested because I thought there really should be a spot where folks can go to learn more about inclusivity, but also how to integrate that into your language. Because language is just the building block of communication. And even though a lot of communication is nonverbal, the words you say really imply what you think and what kind of ideology you have as a human being. But I think the most frustrating part of being a language speaker, which is most of us, especially if you're listening to this, I suppose. But one of the most frustrating things is when you are talking and you don't feel like you're able to communicate effectively, or your speech and the words that you choose to use make you come off in a way that doesn't feel like who you are as an individual. Because as a queer person who moves around a lot of professional spaces, I hear people use language that is inherently racist, transphobic, homophobic, the things that uphold the gender binary, lots of different words that have racist roots to them, or potentially undertones, or even the linguistic history that comes with using some certain words that aren't really appropriate to be using in a broad general sense, but also if you want to be somebody who is kind, who gets along with all kinds of folks, especially if they're different from you. And we've talked about this peripherally on this podcast before, but I really want to dive in here and talk about all the ways that we can modify our use of language in order to include everybody around us. And I didn't really realize that I had done this. And of course, I don't have all of the knowledge and information, but I do have a lot of developed linguistic patterns and phrases and ways about thinking of the ways that I use language in personal, social, educational, professional contexts that really implies that I am an inclusive person, because I do tag myself as an inclusive educator. So it is something that is very important to me. And a reason that it's important to me is because I don't know if victim is the right word, but I've had a lot of experiences where people's language affects me in a negative way, or maybe not even in a negative way, because that almost sounds like I'm a snowflake, which is a whole other part of this conversation that we're going to get to in a minute. But my argument here is that if you can put in a little bit of the headwork, if you can sit down with either this podcast episode or some of the resources that we're going to walk through here today, if you can spend a little bit of your time reframing the way that you use your language in order to make big and meaningful differences in the comfort levels of the people that are around you in your life, why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you do that? But something that I see a lot of folks fall into is that they want to be inclusive, they want to use this language, but they're scared. They're scared, right? It's how do I ask somebody their pronouns? And I don't even do that. I don't know if it's a boomer accent, and hey, that's not me being discriminatory. Anybody can be a boomer. It's not your age, it's your attitude. Being a boomer is an attitude. I've met some 20-year-old boomers. It's all a mindset. So it's not, don't look down at your birthday and be like, me, I'm an awful boomer. No. know. It's a mindset. It's a mindset in the way that I'm going to be talking about it in this podcast. But let's get to this woke idea. Woke has really been bastardized in the last few I don't know, months or years. And you might see it online of people being like, oh, the woke mob, and you're just a bunch of sheeple. And the pandemic definitely is responsible somehow for people thinking that being woke is a bad thing. Because if I think back to the context of woke, maybe in the last few years before the panini happened, sometimes I'm like, do I need to explain that panini means pandemic? The pandemi lovato, any word that starts with P with many syllables probably means pandemic. So pin that if you don't know what that means. But before the pandemi lovato started, I think the way that pop culture really viewed wokeness as maybe the conspiracy theories of it all, like the flat earthers. I found myself on flat earther TikTok, and it's exhausting and somewhat entertaining, but really sad once you dig beneath the camp of it all. But anyhow, I'm getting off track, but you're used to that if you've listened to any more of my podcasts than this one. But what is a podcast if not just a professional yap fest? And that's what I'm doing here, is yapping. And yapping is language, and yapping is communication. So why wouldn't we tinker around with the words that we use in order to be inclusive? So, but in a contemporary context, I think woke sometimes can be used in a derogatory sense. And I've said this many times before, and I will continue to say it, that if you or people around you are using the word woke in a derogatory context, you cannot do that without simultaneously attempting to excuse some sort of discrimination. So what I mean by that is like, oh, if you're asking for their pronouns, you're just woke. I'm like, okay, why is woke a bad thing? If you can put in effort to make people around you feel more comfortable with your use of language when talking about them, why wouldn't you go do it? So my definition of woke is that you have an attunement or an awareness of how your language affects other people in other spaces, specifically when it comes to folks that aren't like you. And I think it's a big mark of maturity, maybe and or professionalism, to be able to look at the experiences of others and go, I don't have that experience, but I'm willing to listen to you and to take your story as not necessarily complete fact, because not all experiences and feelings are facts, but it's valid to be able to listen to a story that does not align with yours and go, wow, I had never thought of that. I'm willing to listen. I'm open to seeing other perspectives. And a lot of people don't have that skill. And I haven't had that skill for my entire life, but I think being a part of the queer community has definitely perpetuated that. Because if we look at the folks in the world that have the most privilege, it's the straight, white, cisgender male. And a lot of these straight, white, cisgender males don't really realize, I think, the amount of privilege that they have moving around our society. But if you look at it from a critical way, why would they? Why would they? Why would they have an awareness of how good they have it just simply because of the things that they were born as and have no control over? Because if you're the most powerful person in a society, if you're at the top of the patriarchy, it would make sense that your awareness of how lucky you are isn't something that you need in order to move around the world, when other folks who do not have all of the same privileges are being constantly reminded, especially not only in the structural way that our governments are built and the systemic oppression that's present for a lot of these folks, because people that deal with different kinds of discrimination are being constantly reminded of this. So it is definitely a larger awareness if you deal with that discriminatory language, discriminatory systems. Like, it makes sense that there's a disconnect in the awareness of how impactful something as simple as our language can do. Our language not only frames our thoughts, but it frames the ways in which we act, and we might not even be aware of how much our language is influencing our actions, which is a part of the reason why I want to record this podcast, is not only for me and to be able to talk through the ways in which I use language in order to solidify it, because I make mistakes, and that goes back to the people that are scared of making mistakes. Girl, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to mess it up. There's going to be some she, her who you call he, him. There's going to be a they, them who you call sir. It's probably going to be me, because it happens on a regular basis. The mistakes are fine. Mistakes are okay if they're not done in an the mistakes are okay if they're not done in a blatantly discriminatory way. However, the important part is what you do after the mistake. Are you actually able to listen to the folks around you after you make a mistake? Are you even paying attention enough, or do you even have a high enough awareness in order to be able to notice when you make those mistakes? Because not all folks are okay correcting people in their mistakes. So then it becomes paying attention to social cues and being aware of other people's behavior and how that might allude to what they're feeling. A huge part of this is having an awareness of other folks and their emotions and this attunement to other people, which I think a lot of us struggle with. I've definitely struggled with that because I've been so busy thinking about me. I haven't been able to really extend my perspective taking skills to that of other people. And if you feel like you're being attacked, for lack of a better word, for your use of language around folks that they don't deem as correct, or that a lot of different diversity, equity, and inclusion institutions deem as appropriate, and even me personally deem as appropriate, it's hard to be able to critically think about the way you use language when you think you are in the wrong. And I think that's where we need to begin here, is that you need to be okay with being wrong. You need to be okay with making mistakes. But thirdly, and most importantly, you need to be able to be comfortable being called in when you are making these mistakes, and you need to be able to make an actual effort to change your use of language. Because if you make the same mistake, 100 times in a row, hell, even 5 times in a row, it kind of becomes clear to the folks around you that you're not interested in modifying your use of language in order to include everybody, which I guess is your choice as a human being. You don't have to put in this work, but if you want to have meaningful relationships with folks around you, you probably need to make this work. And the awesome thing is that it's not that difficult, because once you can really think about the way you use language in these inclusive terms, it's quite simple. It's quite simple to do. And a lot of that has to do with ego and assumptions. So we're going to pin these 2 words of ego and assumptions because those are going to come back later. God, that tea is awful, but I do feel it helping my throat, which is nice. But before we get into ego and assumptions, we need to really nail down what inclusive language means. So there are a lot of different resources that I will link in the description of this episode that you can begin to do some of your own personal work and research into this, because I really encourage you to not end your inclusive language journey after this podcast is over. And if you're listening to this, there's probably a high likelihood that you won't end that journey of inclusive language when this is over, but that you've probably already started. And maybe you're here because you like me and you like the sound of my voice and you're just interested in hearing my perspective on this. But I do encourage you to continue this journey no matter where you are so far. So if you are somebody who is developed in your use of language when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of this might sound a little bit elementary for you, but I am making this podcast episode for the folks who are starting maybe a little bit farther to ground zero. Oh, okay. There we go. There's our first use of inclusive. Okay, so that's a great example right there. Wow, that wasn't even in my notes, but it just came up naturally. I was going to say starting at ground zero. You can tell that I quickly realized that maybe the use of that phrase isn't something that is the most inclusive. Because what do we know ground zero as? Well, there's 2 different meanings to it. Ground zero can mean starting from the bottom, from rock bottom, starting from nowhere, a novice, somebody who doesn't have experience or education in any given subject area. Ground zero is also the location of the Twin Towers in New York City. So if you use a term like ground zero in an educational setting, in a social setting, really anywhere with somebody that has either proximity to that specific attack or proximity to any other attack or tragedy or violence or anything like that, that can upset somebody. And it's not that you need to move around the world being fearful of upsetting folks, because it's not your responsibility to make sure that everybody around you isn't upset all the time. I just want to... If you're thinking about this in the way of like, I need to modify all my language in order to make these snowflakes feel better about themselves because everybody's so triggerable and just nobody has resilience anymore and just like get over it. That's what I want you to get away from, because I don't think that really helps anybody. Because I don't think that really helps anybody, because are there other terms that I can use instead of ground zero to make the point that I'm attempting to make? Absolutely. And okay, so now because I've corrected myself and I've talked it through out loud, or perhaps this would happen in your head if you're not recording a podcast, the next time that my brain is thinking about something that I could potentially use the term ground zero to describe, it's probably going to use the other word that I have yet to think of. Just from the beginning. Anyway, so that was a cool real life example. It's just like, what assumptions are you making as you're using any language in a given context? And I don't think that I would be comfortable using ground zero. And that might be me reading too much into it, because I have been in spaces where attacks, not like that at all, but I have been around mass amounts of violence before. So it's not necessarily that I would be triggered, for lack of a better word. I think triggered is a word that is used a little bit too flippantly these days. But if I was in an educational context and somebody said ground zero, I'm now not listening anymore to anything else that they're saying. I'm distracted because I'm thinking about those attacks in New York City, and then comparing it with my experience in mass violence. And now I'm like 8 sentences behind. I'm not able to keep up with what you're saying because I'm distracted by the other things that have now popped into my head because of your use of the term ground zero. So back to where before this tangent started. This episode is recorded for the folks that maybe don't have a lot of experience, but if you're here and have that experience and you're just interested in my perspective, I appreciate that you're here as well. But we're going to start kind of from the beginning. So, what is inclusive language? The Linguistic Society of America, in its guidelines for inclusive language, describes inclusive language as language that acknowledges diversity, conveys respect to all people, is sensitive to differences, and promotes equal opportunities. A central tenet of inclusive language is for people to think about the impact their words and phrases have on others. Inclusive language avoids terms, phrases, or expressions that could be racist, sexist, or biased against any group of people. So now that we have this somewhat brief understanding of what inclusive language is, why do we use it? What's the point of it? So inclusive language recognizes that words matter and that word choice can be used intentionally or unintentionally, we talked about that in the beginning, to include or exclude others. Using inclusive language communicates with people in a way that is respectful and brings everyone into the conversation. Inclusive language also avoids making assumptions. There's that A word, assumptions. We're going to dive deeper into that later in this podcast. So it avoids making assumptions about people, steering clear of defaults that could make a person feel alienated or unwelcome. So it's not always necessarily this like big, I'm triggered and I'm upset and you're the worst person in the world because you said ground zero. No, it's not that, but it is a small distractor that implies something that might be distracting to somebody else, or that they might not feel necessarily included by your use of language. And this goes without saying, but maybe you don't know, you want to include everyone. You want to include everyone. It feels so shitty to be excluded from really anything. And I don't think there's really ever a legitimate reason to exclude somebody on purpose. But that's the thing here. It's not always done on purpose. So you can unintentionally exclude somebody with your use of language, but you need to start intentionally including people with all your language. That's the difference there. If you don't use inclusive language and you don't know better, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it just means that you can modify things in order to improve the lives of those around you with your use of language. Is that your responsibility as a human being, to improve the life of everybody around you? I mean, that's arguable. I don't think it's always going to be your responsibility because we don't always have the bandwidth in order to do that. But I think it should be a priority, at least to some point, that if you have the power and the agency in order to do so, why wouldn't you, you know? And that's why we're here. All right, it continues. The ultimate goal of inclusive language is to create an environment in which everyone is empowered to speak and feel confident that their voice will be heard. By choosing to use gender-neutral terms, avoiding terms that make assumptions or revert to defaults, and being mindful of historical context, we are actively working to include and create spaces for everyone to be their authentic selves. We're going to talk about specific examples later, so pin those because we're going to get down to, the meat and potatoes of this all, but we're going to work through this article and really start laying the groundwork here before we get into the specifics. So, why is inclusive language important? Using inclusive language is an important step towards making everyone feel seen, heard, and valued. By choosing to use language that includes a wide range of individuals and groups, you can contribute contribute to an environment of psychological safety and respect for all. Again, it's not something of like, I need to change my language to the, again, that accent comes out. I don't know if it's like an old Western person that I think is like, I don't know, racist and homophobic. And that's problematic in itself because there's Southern people who I'm sure are very nice and use inclusive language. So that's a sweeping generalization that I use, and I should work on that. I'm going to start working on that right now. But some people think that you need to modify all your language in order to include everybody because everybody's a snowflake. And that's just not the case, because sometimes people don't even recognize why they're uncomfortable. Because if I'm in a space where somebody says, ladies and gentlemen, well, okay, so I would recognize this now. But let's say 5 years ago, when I didn't have a heightened awareness of how language affects our relationship to other people in the spaces that we're in, if somebody said ladies and gentlemen, it would make me slightly uncomfortable, but it would also like take out the buy-in that I would have. Like I would be less invested with what this person had to say after they said ladies and gentlemen, because it just, for me at least anyway, it hits the ear wrong because it perpetuates the gender binary. There are more than ladies and gentlemen. There just are. Hi, my name's David. They. It pays to advertise. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a non-binary individual. So when you're out there in spaces and say, hi, ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't really include me. And that's a really small example. And it's not like I'm going to be sitting in the audience, like seething and writing a letter to their HR department being like, this person said ladies and gentlemen, and I'm a they, them. Like, no, but I am going to be less interested in what you have to say after you use terms like that. So if you want to be more effective in what you're saying and communicate with folks better and really be more heard by everybody, because you can look at this in like selfish terms as well, because if you're alienating people with your language in spaces where you want people to be listening and learning from you, it would make more sense that you should include all of them in the language that you're using so they're able to follow you down the thought paths that you're having. And that can be in work settings, it can be in social settings, it can be in educational settings. It just makes logical and neuroscientific sense to use the language that includes everybody if you are attempting to bring everybody along in the journey that you are trying to, right? If you're telling a story with a bunch of friends, if you are teaching a math concept, like use this language so that everybody can follow your thought patterns, because if they can't, it pulls them out and then you're not an effective leader, friend, teacher, anything, right? I should really be reading my own notes here because I'm stealing from all of my points because I'm just going off on seemingly tangents, but these aren't tangents. This is exactly what I want to say. But anyhow, so it talks about some of the benefits of using inclusive language, and it's kind of what we talked about, but using inclusive language contributes to a sense of belonging as people from a wide range of backgrounds feel welcomed, valued, and empowered to bring their full selves to their work. And then according to some research, fostering a sense of belonging is a priority for 79% of organizations who agreed that the value of belonging was important to their organization's success to the next 12 to 18 months. So that's kind of the selfish thing. You shouldn't really be framing using inclusive language in order to manipulate people, because that's not really an ethical thing, but in order to just make everybody feel seen and welcomed and like they belong, because you should be going out of your way in order to make people feel like they belong in the spaces that they're in. It's just part of being a good person. I'm sorry. And it's not that if you don't have the skills and practice at this, that doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it means that you have some work to do, because everybody at some point feels excluded, and it's a really shitty feeling. It is. And whether you recognize it or not, it does feel bad. It takes a toll on your mental health. And over time, this systemic oppression through the use of language can really change the structure. No, not the structure, can really change the function of your brain, which can contribute to some mental health problems. And then when this kind of systematic oppression happens to groups of folks, I think about indigenous communities in our world, then you have intergenerational trauma. And then because the function of your brain is different, then you have children and their brains are impacted by the ways that your brain functions. And then it leads to different mental health problems that become generational, or addiction problems that become generational. And it's just this big problem that snowballs across generations. So we have the power in order to include people with our language so we can at least So we can not necessarily stop that snowball. You using inclusive language isn't going to reverse intergenerational trauma today, but it is going to be a part of blocking that snowball from falling down the mountain and gaining that momentum. You will be a small drop in the bucket, but it's just like vaccinations. It's just like masking. No, you're not going to solve the world's problems by you, one individual, taking this action. But if everybody does it, then it makes a huge impact. And once you start using this language, other people might start asking, oh, why do you say that? And then it grows and it grows. And then the snowball starts rolling up the mountain. I don't know. So don't think that just because you're one individual, you can't make an impact, because you absolutely can. Okay, so we've really laid the groundwork here. Hopefully you have a better understanding of what inclusive language is, why it is used, and why it is important. We've talked about the ego of it all. You need to be able to take your ego out of the equation. You need to be willing to be wrong and called in when things need to be changed in order to be inclusive to the folks that are around you. We've talked about the personal motivations you might be able to harness in order to remember that inclusive language is important for everybody. And we're going to take a little bit of a break here, but when we come back, we're going to talk about assumptions, and we're going to nail this down with some specific examples as it comes to gender identity, sexual orientation, ableism, racism, all of these specific concrete examples that you can start integrating in your language on a regular basis. So I'm going to go take a break and finish this awful cup of tea, and I will be right back. All right, babies, welcome back to episode 12 of season 2 of D-Talk. Here we're talking about inclusive language. We're going to talk about some specific examples of how you can modify your use of language, or rather you can start to challenge some of the assumptions you make as you are using language as we move around the world in order to include everybody that is around you. So we're going to start with non-gendered language examples. So this article from Workhuman says the following: much of our everyday language has an implicit bias towards two genders, male and female. You know, the gender binary, gross. And one sexuality, which is heterosexual, rather straight people. And this dismissal or outright erasing people who identify as non-binary or part of the queer community. So gender neutral or gender inclusive language acknowledges diversity by removing assumptions of a male as normal language and instead uses a gender neutral default, they instead of he, that is inclusive to everybody of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And this does, as we get into this, I don't want you to be overwhelmed at the big task of like doing a complete overhaul of all of your use of language. Perhaps you can pick a category that you feel would be the most impactful for the folks that are around you. But honestly, once you have a conceptual understanding about all of your language and all of the assumptions that you make, because it is a skill to be able to, in real time, think about the assumptions you're making when you are using language. And once you have that skill developed, it's actually very quite simple and doesn't take a whole lot of your working memory. But in the beginning, like any other endeavor that you choose to engage in, as a human who's attempting to learn something new, it can be overwhelming. It's not easy, but it is kind of simple. So that's what we're here to do together. So, you know, you've heard these terms of like chairman or mailman or milkman. I don't know, you know, milkman is definitely archaic at this point, but any word that uses the term man in it, I think that can go. I think you can take that right out. So instead of saying policeman or fireman, why can't you just say firefighter? It's a very small, but potentially very meaningful difference for people who are in that profession. If you're a firefighter and you happen to identify as a woman, there's the potential that you might feel excluded by somebody calling you a fireman because you're not, right? So instead of saying chairman, you would say chairperson or just chair, right? It's that inclusive language. So instead of saying things like manpower, you could say workforce. It's really paying attention to the ways in which your language places an identity upon another person that you're not sure they identify with, right? It's just, I know I've said this before. It's just being a good person. It's really not that complicated. So continuing here, it says avoid heteronormative language or gendered assumptions. So heteronormative, hetero, of course, referring to heterosexual. The word heteronormative is simply talking about the idea that you're implying that hetero-ness, being straight, is what is normal and that is the standard, and that people only deviate from that standard, which we know, of course, is not the case. So heteronormative language are these things that imply an identity onto another person that might not identify with that thing. So a big one is, hey guys, I really hate this one. And this is the one that started my journey personally, because I worked in a store that I would say, hey guys, to everybody. We don't need to say that. We don't need to say that. That's kind of going along with the same thing of like ladies and gentlemen. It's just implying gender with your use of language on folks that might not identify with that. Are most people going to care? Probably not. But the ones that will make a difference for, it'll be just such a beautiful moment for that person if you can use language that is inclusive. So something that I did is I started referring to the number of people that I was seeing. So if there were 2 people walking towards me that I wanted to acknowledge, I wouldn't say, hey guys, I would say, hey you 2. Or, hey, you 3. It kind of gets messy after 3. Hey, you 4. Hey, you 5. I remember there was this guy that walked in with a group of people in a store that I worked at. Oh, and David's tea. I'm currently drinking it right now. And I think there were 3 or 4 of them. And I said, hey, you 4. And this guy looked at me and he was like, hey, you 1. Like, so there's the potential for people to be like, not necessarily off-put, but not understand why you're using that language. But that's okay, because he probably wouldn't have cared if I said, hey, you guys, but maybe he would have. Maybe that's an assumption, right? So, okay, so all of these words like, do you have a husband? Do you have a wife, a boyfriend, a girlfriend? This is a really big one when kids are growing up. If you're talking to a child that is a girl, you could say, do you have a boyfriend yet? Ugh, that's so gross. I hate that. Don't say that. Never say that. You probably haven't said that if you're listening to this podcast, but you probably heard people say that, and that's gross. Don't imply sexuality when you're talking to somebody that sexuality isn't a part of their lived experience yet. In my opinion, it's just a little bit inappropriate as well. You don't need to be using language like that. So instead of saying things like husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, you can say partner, you know. This was another really big one I learned when I was a teacher, is that saying your mom and dad, when teachers are talking to a group of kids and saying, take this home to your mom and dad. Oh, that really just like, that pings me right in my spine. First of all, not everybody has a mom and dad. And not everybody has 2 parents. Not everybody even has 1 parent. What if they're living with 1 grandparent? What if they're living with 2 grandparents? What if their grandparents are gay? What if their parents are gay? What if they're both non-binary? There are so many different options and different kinds of family units that folks can have these days. Damn it, there's that accent again. But nowadays, and it's not that it's nowadays, because people have always had diverse family units, but our language is starting to modify in order to include people, because especially in a setting where you're working with younger people who don't have developed discernment skills as to recognize why you are using the language that you're using. If I'm a kid who has 2 dads and you say, give this to your mom and dad, then that sets up that heteronormative framework for me to go home and say, well, which one of you is my mom? And it just, you see how it kind of snowballs here? Like those little moments where you can make a choice to modify your language can make a really big difference. So what I would say is talk to your humans at home. Talk to your people. Talk to your people at home. Talk to your humans at home. You know, those people at home that take care of you, them. Those ones, you know, the ones that probably force you to eat your broccoli at night, like those ones. Talk to those people. And I'm not using gender norms. I'm not using heteronormative language. It's just, you know, those people. Yeah, because this is part of challenging the assumptions that you're making with your use of language that can be really meaningful to the folks that need it. And the ones that don't need it probably won't even notice it. And that's the universal design for inclusion. So that just means that the folks that need it will notice it, and the folks that don't need it won't notice it. And that's kind of the ideal situation that you're going for here. So another simple step to avoid reinforcing the exclusionary gender binary is to normalize sharing pronouns. So even if you are somebody who doesn't feel like you need to share your pronouns because it's obvious, look at me, I'm obviously a woman, I'm a cis woman, I look like a woman. There's problematic language embedded in what I just said there as well. But if everybody makes a habit of sharing their pronouns, it kind of takes the onus off of people who deviate from the norm, right? I look like a man. Okay, I'm just gonna say it. I look like a man, and it's not that that makes me uncomfortable, but I hate being put into the box of sir. I really hate sir. I went out this morning to do a few little errands, and I just first thing in the morning getting hit with sir by like five people in a row in different settings, just like grinded down my soul and my light for living just a little bit because I don't identify with he him pronouns. I don't like it. I've never liked it. It made me uncomfortable for my entire life, and I wasn't really able to nail down why, except for the last handful of years where I have embraced being non-binary. My pronouns are they them, but the problem is am I going to go out there and correct all of these people that say sir? It is my choice, and you can make the choice to do that if you want, but ultimately I think that's a little bit of a waste of time for me personally, because I'm probably never going to see that person again. So if everybody shares their pronouns or uses gender inclusive language or uses inclusive language, it wouldn't be a problem for anybody if they said just, oh, good morning. Like you don't need to put any other words on it. It doesn't need to be good morning, sir. Have a good day, sir. Ooh, I hate that so much. Like, okay, I do have a beard and I have a deep voice, kind of end of list. I don't really know, because as I'm looking in the monitor now, I'm like, do I have masculine traits? Like, what does that bone structure say to me? But that's participating in the gender binary, and then I'm assigning the sound of my voice a gender. I'm assigning hair on my face a gender. I don't think there's a point to that. The only point to that actually is putting people in boxes so they become easier to control, which is a whole other conversation, but we're going to move on there. So this comes down to the moments where you're introducing yourself to somebody, saying, hi, my name's David, my pronouns are they, them. You leave space for them to share their pronouns with you. Even though you're pretty sure you know what their pronouns are, you can still ask, because that's the whole point here. Because you don't assume somebody's pronouns. You don't look at them and judge your perceived masculinity or femininity that you are gleaning from this person in this very moment in order to assign them a pronoun. The folks who get upset about asking pronouns, I think they're the ones that are snowflakes. Like I'm obviously a man. Why would, again, that accent comes out. I'm going to keep working on that. It'll be a journey. I'll let you know. But the people who are like, why are you asking my pronouns? I'm obviously a man. I think if we're going to describe anybody as a snowflake, it's those folks, because it takes 2 friggin' seconds for you to be able to say, hi, yeah, my pronouns are he, him. Simple, easy, done. But in those moments, if you're using that language, it does leave room for gender non-conforming folks like me to be able to comfortably share my pronouns, because there's nothing worse than sitting in a group of people, notably a straight group of people, and you're going around the circle introducing yourself, and I say, hi, my name's David and my pronouns are they, them, and then nobody else says their pronouns, because they're all heteronormative and like, look at me, obviously I'm a woman, look at me, obviously I'm a man, so now I'm the one who is othered. And that's the whole point here with inclusive language, is that you don't want anybody to feel othered, because that doesn't lead to psychological safety in spaces, it doesn't lead to learning, it doesn't lead to feeling connected to other folks, and that's really the best part of life, is connecting to other people. It really is. We're social beings, our brains are built that way. Connect with other people, and inclusive language is a way that you can connect with other people, which is beautiful. So do it. Anyway, we're going to move on now from the gender conversation, and now we're going to talk about stereotypes and culturally inappropriate phrases. This article says that idioms or phrases that mean something different than the actual words being used can be quite common in professional and educational settings, but bring with them a complex or outright negative historical context. For one, divide and conquer may seem harmless and a shorthand for tackling a project strategically, but the phrase carries connotations of oppression and colonialism. It's hard too, because some of these phrases are used so frequently in many communities, and it's like, oh, well, if everybody else is using it, it's not a problem that I'm using it too. But then you're becoming complicit in the oppression of other people, and language is a huge part of that. Okay, so we'll walk through some examples here. So being gypped by somebody can be like a colloquialism for being ripped off or duped or tricked. And the historical context of this, so gypped is a racist term that describes being cheated or defrauded. It stems from the word gypsy, which was originally applied to the Romani people, right? It's not appropriate. Don't say that. The next one is guru. So this could be a colloquialism for for an expert or an authority. So the historical context is that guru is used in Buddhist and Hindu religions to refer to a spiritual guide or healer. A guru is a title of high esteem. So to use that word as shorthand for your experience in any given subject trivializes the importance of the title and its origins. So not everybody that hears that word guru is going to be affected by it in a negative way, but the chances of you being in the presence of somebody who practices or has experience in the Buddhist or Hindu religions in our diversified world, and thank God for that, that's a high probability. So it's taking these words and really constructing your use of language around words that you know could negatively affect somebody else, because it's inappropriate. Don't use guru. The next one is tribe. So this is a colloquialism for a group, a crew, a community, or a circle. So this idea of tribe is definitely very popular. You've probably heard it before, and it associates with the primitiveness or savagery offenses to African people. So for Indigenous folks, the First Nations peoples, the term tribe is a bureaucratic word assigned by the US government. So that is a very colonial word, and especially for me in Canada, there are Indigenous folks everywhere. But that also is problematic too, because you don't want to be only using inclusive language when you are thinking that you're in the presence of the people who it might offend, because that's not the point here. Your language should be modified in all spaces, because, okay, let's say that I'm with folks who are only white and there's no Indigenous folks in the room. It's not then appropriate for me to say the word tribe, because then that reinforces the idea with all of those white folks that tribe is an okay word to use. And then when they leave that room and are in the presence of Indigenous folks, you see what I mean here is that it doesn't matter if you're around those people, but that also contributes to the fallacy of you being able to look at somebody to identify whether they're Indigenous, to identify whether they're a man. It's just, we need to not make those judgments about the physical stature of a person in front of us and whether they fit our conceptualization of what that culture or gender or anything looks like in the world. It's not our place to visually identify somebody as a certain culture or gender. It's just not appropriate. The next one falls under the same category. So this idea of a spirit animal, people definitely say this quite a bit. And spirit animal is a colloquialism described as the patroness or kindred spirit. So spirit animal is usually popularized to mean a favorite or relatable animal. And it also reinforces the stereotype that homogenizes a diverse group of people and customs. So a spirit animal is not just your favorite animal. You can just say favorite animal. It doesn't need to be that, because a spirit animal is not just your favorite animal in some context, so it's just not appropriate to say. The next one is blacklist. So a block list or deny list or allow list, right? We've heard this word blacklist before. So you can use these other words like block list or deny list. So the term equates black with bad and white with good, which is a problematic and racist association. And there are other words that have this kind of negative connotation to the word black, which is racist. So don't use it. This last one I didn't know, which was really interesting to me. Peanut gallery is a colloquial term for hecklers or jokesters. And the peanut gallery is a phrase from the late 19th century that referred to the cheapest seats or the section for Black folks in segregated theaters. So you see how something seemingly so simple, like a phrase like peanut gallery, if you use that around a person who has dealt with the systemic oppression of racism, and if they have a different function to their brain because of the intergenerational trauma from their ancestors who experienced that more blatant and systemic racism, not that it's gone today, but it definitely was much worse in historical contexts, that can be upsetting to them and distracting for them. So don't use it. Don't say peanut gallery. Another one that falls into the category that isn't on this list is the term spooky. Yeah, it's not an appropriate word to say. It is a word with racist origins, so you can use the word scary, unsettling. There's lots of other ones that I can't think of, but spooky in particular is not a word that is very appropriate to use to describe things that are uncomfortable or scary to you. All right, so we have one more category as it comes to these colloquialisms and how you can modify your language in order to include people, and this one has to do with ableism. So ableist language is a language that is derogatory towards folks with disabilities that suggests that disability is abnormal or perpetuates stereotypes of weakness. So this language bias can also implicitly define a person by their disability status. So there's kind of two different ways that you can combat this ableist language. So you can use first person language, which prioritizes the person over the disability. So you would say a person with a substance use disorder rather than an addict, right? A person who is experiencing homelessness instead of a homeless person, right? These little switches switches in language make a bigger difference than you might think, especially if you're not somebody who has experienced homelessness. You know, if you haven't had these experiences, it might seem pointless to you, but it's because you haven't had that experience. That's why it seems pointless to you. That kind of works too in the terms of not knowing somebody's pronouns, and maybe you're not comfortable to ask. So instead of saying him, say the name. Or say them. Use words that would be inclusive to everybody. And then identity first language is used when an individual chooses to reclaim a disability diagnosis or chronic condition as a part of their identity or expression of cultural pride. So you could say deaf person rather than person with deafness or hearing impaired. So I do have to note here that it does vary from person to person, as language does with everybody across the world. So you can ask people if maybe you have somewhat of a rapport with them, how they would like to be referred to, because it can vary from person to person. But these kind of broad things would put you in a position of being the most inclusive as you can without knowing each individual person, if that makes sense. So you wouldn't say a disabled person or a handicapped person, because it's just not appropriate. So instead of saying that, you could say people with disabilities or a person with a disability. So you're putting the person before the disability and avoiding terms that imply the person is less than or weak. The disabled removes the humanity from a group of people by referring to them solely as a generalized disability status. Note that disabled person may be an acceptable term for individuals embracing identity first language. When you are doubtful, ask. The next problematic phrase is wheelchair bound. I've never heard this before used, but it probably has been. So you could say a wheelchair user or person who uses a wheelchair. So again, you're avoiding language that frames any form of mobility equipment or assistive support as a limitation to the user. It's person first language, which is a very important part of this conversation. So these are examples to help you identify exclusionary language and provide some guidance when you are unsure of an individual's preferred identifier or the specifics of a group's identity. So yeah, those are some examples there. It's definitely not an exhaustive list, and there would be people out in the world who would identify with the groups that I was just talking about that wouldn't agree with me in what I just said, and that's okay, because you have to be able to be willing and listen to everybody that's around you. And especially as we talk about things like ableism and racism and discrimination in those forms, I'm not really qualified in the terms of having that life experience in order to talk about it, but I, like everybody out in the world, interact with folks who do use wheelchairs. I interact with people who do experience racism. So while I'm not qualified to give an exhaustive, extensive list of how to interact with people like that in terms of using inclusive language, I do have a responsibility as a human being moving around the world in order to modify my own language as much as possible to make those folks feel comfortable around me. And maybe that's just a personal value that I have as an individual, that I want people to feel safe around me, because I've experienced a lot of moments where I haven't been safe around people. I hate that feeling. I hate that experience. So it's just a personal value of mine. And that's why I worked on it a lot. I have this understanding. My ego is out of there. I'm ready to be called in if I use language that's not appropriate. I challenge the assumptions. I'm thinking about the assumptions I'm making as I'm talking. Sometimes even before I say something, I'll modify my language. But if something does come out, I'm able to go back, modify, change, explain, apologize if necessary. Yeah, babes, that brings us to the end of episode 12 of G-Talk here. I hope you have learned something. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that you would like to add to this conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video if you like the podcast episode. And again, let me know what you thought down there in the comments. I'd really love to know. If you're listening to this on Spotify, consider leaving me a review or ask a question. It all goes really far to support my content, and I appreciate you so much for doing that. Thank you for getting to the end of this episode. I appreciate you being here so much. I'm so happy and grateful that I'm here still recording these podcast episodes. I'm having the best time. I'm learning so much. I'm improving my speaking and communication skills beyond my wildest dreams. So I'm happy that you're here for that and supporting me. Thanks for joining me. I hope you learned something. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe, leave a review, do all the things. You look great today. Thanks for joining me. And until the next one, goodbye.